Scores of suspected al-Qaeda and Taliban were arrested in Afghanistan and taken to black sites in different nations. However, men such as Mamdouh Habib and Maher Arar suffered the same ordeal even though neither one of them had terrorist ties. But why were they picked up in the first place is a lingering question.
Maher Arar, a Syrian-born 34-year-old Canadian citizen and McGill University graduate, was arrested on September 26, 2002 at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. His detainment was the result of his name being on a United States watch list of terrorism suspects. Arar was changing planes after he had been vacationing with his family in Tunisia when he was detained by U.S. officials. Instead of returning to Canada, he was first flown to Washington, then Portland, Maine, followed by Rome, Italy, and finally Amman, Jordan. While en route to the various destinations, Arar learned that the Special Removal Unit was planning to take him to Syria. After having been told about the atrocious practices of police officers in Syria, Arar pleaded with crew members that he not be sent there for fear of being tortured. Crew members ignored his requests, instead opting to invite him to watch a spy movie being aired on board. Arar was driven to Syria over 10 hours after landing in Jordan. After 1 day of threats is when interrogators began beating Arar. His hands were whipped with 2-inch thick electrical cables, and he was kept in an underground cell without windows, to which Arar likened to a grave. The majority of his questioning concerned possible connections to another terrorism suspect. However, Arar mentioned that he hardly knew the suspect, though he had briefly worked with the suspect's brother. When questioning first began, Arar proclaimed innocence. However, he eventually confessed to phony charges, simply to appease his interrogators. In October of 2003, Arar was released without any charges. The Syrian ambassador to Washington, Imad Mustafa, declared that his country couldn't link Arar to any form of terrorism. Mamdouh Habib is another example of an innocent person subjected to rendition without much evidence linking them to terrorism. Habib, born in Egypt, later an Australian citizen, was detained in October of 2001 in Pakistan. Habib's wife mentioned that her husband was in Pakistan to look at religious schools for their children and whether or not the family should move there or not. Contrarily, the Pentagon wrote that Habib is a man who has expressed support for Islamist causes, and that for the majority of his trip he was in Afghanistan, either supporting hostile forces or on the battlefield fighting illegally against the U.S. For 3 weeks, Habib was harshly questioned by interrogators. Some spoke English with American accents. After this, Habib was put under the supervision of 2 Americans who cut his clothing off with scissors, put a jumpsuit on him, covered his eyes with opaque goggles, and put him on a private plane bound for Egypt. For 6 months, Habib was interrogated, beaten frequently with blunt instruments, including something he compared to an electric cattle prod. He was also told that if he didn't confess to being an al-Qaeda member, that he would be anally raped by specially trained dogs. Habib also mentioned how he was put into shackles and forced to stand in 3 rooms, one with water filled up to his chin, thus requiring him to stand on the tip of his toes for hours, another with low ceilings and water up to his knees, forcing him to stoop. In the last, he stood in a room with water up to his ankles and an electric switch and generator within sight. Interrogators threatened to electrocute Habib if he didn't confess. According to his lawyer, Habib eventually submitted to all the demands of his interrogators and confessed to multiple charges, all of them false. In late 2004, Habib was finally released without any charges pressed against him.
Habib and Arar were both subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques, even though they were innocent and charges were never formally filed against them. Did the extraordinary rendition program, a program seldom used by the CIA, overstep its original intent? Zubaydah and Sheikh Mohammed were put through the intense SEER program, and information was extracted from them. But what plots did the information foil, exactly? The terms torture and enhanced interrogation are synonymous, and putting aside the euphemisms, techniques such as waterboarding rarely generate useful intelligence. How can one call such techniques torture when they're being done to U.S. personnel, and enhanced interrogation when persons on the behalf of the United States are doing it to others? The United States of America has long prided itself as a moral beacon, the shining city upon a hill, as former President Reagan famously uttered. However, the disclosure of unfavorable methods of interrogation threatened to erode the image of a nation. a nation which suffered thousands of casualties after 9/11 and gained worldwide goodwill and support to combating the rise of Islamic extremism. If we wish to regain that image, we must acknowledge that we, as the moral arbiters, shouldn't use methods of interrogation on detainees we so far along have shunned.